As leaders, we can't predict the future, but our job is to figure out what we're trying to do and then set our organizations up to succeed within that. We have made everything in strategy and execution and innovation linear processes. Growth is a loop, not a line.
We're joined today by Dr. Rebecca Homkes, author of Survive, Reset, Thrive. Well, she's going to challenge everything you think you know about strategy and decision-making under uncertainty.
Rebecca, welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, David and Stephen. I'm so delighted to be here.
Super. Well, thank you for joining us. Would you be able to give us just an introduction briefly to yourself and maybe talk a bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Rebecca Homkes. I'm a faculty member at the London Business School, as well as do corporate education, and advisor and faculty at Boston Consulting Group U, where I lead our AI transformation courses. But I spend most of my time working directly with high growth organizations, so CEOs and executive teams who want to go on a breakthrough journey. I also do some speaking and obviously some writing with the recent book, but my passion is around working with teams who want to go on these high growth journeys.
Wow, it certainly sounds like you're very busy, and sort of AI is obviously very relevant. We'll touch on that in a little bit. But could you maybe mention some of the real pivotal moments that you've had in your career, and also what of those prompted you to set up your own boutique? Because it can obviously be quite a leap making that change from being a corporate employee or going from academia into actually running your own consultancy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to say that it was always the master plan, but I was one of those who thought I would work in the consultancy, and I had worked at Bain and as well as McKinsey. And now, of course, I'm an advisor to BCG, so I've dabbled in all three of them accidentally. And after I finished my PhD at the London School of Economics, I was working in a joint LSE McKinsey project. So from my very early 20s doing my PhD, I got to lead this global leadership and management project, and it was a great experience. I got to write for the McKinsey Quarterly, give speeches all around the world. And then after that experience and with the PhD, going back to a consulting firm and being an entry-level consultant was no longer very appealing. And luckily I had a great colleague at the London Business School who said, hey, all of this work you've done in measuring leadership and management, I want to do the same thing for measuring strategy execution. Can you give me 6 months? And so I said, sure, absolutely. Mid to late 20s in London, single, you got all the time in the world, right? So I was like, 6 months at LBS before I move back to the US and get a real job, no problem. Started doing that, got to teach and exec ed at LBS because I'd been teaching at the London School of Economics, found a wonderful fit there, got to work on several YPO programs, which is the Young Presence Organization. And a few people in those programs asked me to come back to their companies and do some consulting. So again, I said, yeah, I'll do this for a couple of months and then I'll move back to the US and get a real job. And then after a couple of months, I said, well, I'll just keep doing this consulting / teaching thing till it doesn't work. And that was about 12 to 15 years ago at this point. So I'm pretty confident to say that it worked. And after a couple of years, I decided to drop pretending I wanted to do anything else. I'd found my passion. And so I solidified it into the consultancy and started to codify everything into my own methodology of growth.
Well, that's brilliant.
Sorry, Steve.
Sorry, good example of the short term ending up as the long term then.
Absolutely.
As it actually happened.
I also moved to London. My journey to London was supposed to be 2 years, and that ended up being 17. And it's still part of my home, and I'm now a dual citizen. So you've got to just be open to saying yes as things pop up along the way.
I was going to say what surprised you the most, but it just sounds like the longevity of a short term, possible short term assignment seems to have maybe been sort of such a big driver. Is there anything else that's really been quite surprising for you?
Well, if we think career-wise, when I started doing this, my background, my PhD is in economics. So I loved large data sets, large data analysis, understanding how do you quantify seemingly qualitative things. So it started in kind of management and then leadership. My PhD was looking at doing that for public-private partnerships. And I started, David, thinking, well, I'm going to focus on strategy execution. And the more I started doing that, I realized you can't talk about executing a strategy without a growth strategy. And I kept having to move back earlier and earlier in the chain. And my big realization was we have completely lost the insights in strategy. We have over-templated and frameworked strategy to a point. It's filling in the same boxes and the same templates for every organization of every size and every industry, and the insights are completely gone. And so you can't execute that anymore. So starting an execution, I had to back into strategy and then realized what I was really loving, and frankly, what very few companies were doing well, was really putting together a growth strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that with a lot of big companies that
Hmm.
strategy has become this monstrosity where you end up with these 100-slide PowerPoints full of
Yes.
endless analysis and all sorts of promises about the future. But the essence of strategy and well, what is actually the secret formula for growth, or at least what they believe it to be, is often completely lost in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 100 if you're lucky, right, Stephen? I mean, usually thousands
Yeah.
in these bigger organizations.
Yeah.
And the strategic plan has become a budgeting and tactic addition exercise. And what I'm trying to do is say, let's go back to the basics and put the growth and the insights back into strategy, which involves some mindset shifts, right? So I'm putting some mind share in, and that's when companies start to see the difference.
Mm. So, Rebecca, I've
Yeah.
got this book on my desk here called
Ah,
"Survive, Reset, Thrive." I've
look
been
at that.
enjoying
Yes.
reading this
Yeah.
the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Could you give us a super brief introduction to the book and maybe point out who most needs to read this book? Like, whose hands does it really need to fall into?
Well, it fell into the right hands right there, Stephen, right?
Well,
Because
thank
you've
you.
got it. And I know that we've chatted about it quite a bit. So, Survive, Reset, Thrive is based on over a decade of my growth strategy methodology, but I never crystallized it into those words until 2020. And what happened during March 2020, it's now been over 4 years, but I think for many of us doesn't feel like that long, was what was happening is over a series of a couple of weeks, I was having the same conversation over and over and over again with CEOs. And they would, do the whole why me? Why now? Rebecca, we had this growth strategy. We'd finally built the culture that we wanted. Everything was working so well. And now I've got this crisis. It's not fair. And I had this realization and I said, we can't call ourselves entrepreneurs if you can't grow a company in bad times too, right? So if you want to wear that badge of an entrepreneurial leader, now is the time to step up your game. Here's what we're going to do. You need to stabilize the organization because there's been a massive system shock. We need to reset because the situations change. Then you can go back to thriving. And just repeating that over and over, it kind of crystallized into Survive, Reset, Thrive. And the book started as an email, which then went into a strategy package, which then went into a long series of articles, and then, of course, is now crystallized in the book. And the key punchline is growth is a loop, not a line. And I know that sounds overly simplistic, but we have made everything in strategy and execution and innovation linear processes,
Mm.
checklist and stage gates and things that you've got to meet. And the real world is a loop. And Survive, Reset, Thrive is bust out of this notion everything needs to be a linear checklist. Embrace the fact that it's a loop, which means you can be in Survive and have to go back to Reset or Thrive. But growth is a loop, not a line. And the better you get through moving that loop and building capability, the better you'll grow over time.
Yeah, so but both David and myself are from the financial world, so we're quite
Yeah.
familiar with the world of financial markets. So whether it's
Hmm.
from a more of an investment perspective, like
Hmm.
David, or I was a trader myself for many years, and I've always had this beef with the idea that uncertainty and volatility are bad things because
Yes.
in financial markets, as a financial professional, you need these things to make money, and yet we see so many leaders, so many corporate leaders are anti uncertainty. They have this idea that it's all terrible. If only we could iron out the volatility and the
Hmm.
uncertainty in the world. And in the first chapter of your book, you make a really strong point about this.
Hmm.
So why do you think it is that so
Yeah.
many leaders are so risk averse about
Hmm.
uncertainty?
Yeah. It is such an issue, Stephen. So thank you for asking. Yes, if you go back to your trading life, without uncertainty, we don't have the margins, right, to make
Well,
some of those
exactly.
bets
Yeah.
and make the money, right? Is there is certainly an evolutionary nature to it, right? So that is not my area of expertise. So economists try to tread very lightly, right, when they're talking about that. But look, our brains are framed to view the unknown as bad and go into protection, right? So there's some of it that we can't help without training, right? Again, we are from the very beginning of biological time. If we didn't know what was happening next, we had to go into protection mode. But we do it to ourselves as leaders. And if you listen to colleagues and other leaders talk about uncertainty, you'll notice they always put a word before it that means it's going to be bad.
Mm.
We ask each other in conferences and meetings, how is your team managing uncertainty? How are we going to overcome uncertainty, get through uncertainty? And my favorite with the election cycles of this year, we're just going to wait until the election uncertainty is over. Like magically in November of
It
2024, the world will be perfectly crystal clear
will
when
be
we
clear.
know that it's not. So we frame it with that language, and language matters. And so you've got to pause and just constantly define. The definition of uncertainty is a series of future events which may or may not occur, right? Whether or not those events are good or bad depends on what we're trying to do and how we're set up. So as leaders, we can't predict the future, but our job is to figure out what we're trying to do and then set our organizations up to succeed within that.
Do you think there's an element of career risk with that for leaders?
Mhm.
Because I think if you think about maybe private market firms which don't have the
Mhm.
quarterly reporting, they're maybe more
Mhm.
comfortable taking those longer term risks.
Mhm.
Whereas if you've got the quarterly reporting like in America and some European
Yeah.
countries, there's that focus. So you've got very little margin for error. And as you
Mhm.
say, they talk about the downside risk because it's bad for them, it's bad for companies. Whereas actually, it's probably worse to be so short term focused.
Yeah, there's certainly a short term versus midterm and long term. But what I've seen, especially if I think of all the large private US companies that I work with, is it can actually make you more risk adverse, right? Because if you're family owned or family founded, or there's a cultural legacy in the business, then their boards, David, actually become very protectionist. Not on my watch, kind of not when we
Mm.
are in the governing position will something happen to this legacy of a company. So there's 5,000 issues, right, with the quarterly reporting cycle, and you're seeing it because we're in earnings week right now. But I'm actually have to sometimes push private
Mm.
organizations to open that growth mindset more so than public. Because if you're in a public market, you of course do have that expectation, but you also have a shareholder expectation of growth, where in private companies, the default is actually more so protection.
That's an interesting take
Yeah.
because
Mm.
others would say that the benefit of being privately owned is that you can take a longer term, multi
Hmm.
generational
Yeah.
perspective. You don't have this short term career cycle like a lot of public company
Mhm.
CEOs do. Yeah, it's
It's
an interesting take.
absolutely it's absolutely part of their competitive advantage. But
Mm.
you need to then have a team, right? And a board that's willing to do that and then invest in the capability, right? And I know that the two of you know this very well. We can't act like if you want to grow a strategy, it will happen, right? There is an investment in the capability of growth, which feels at the moment like a distraction from just executing the plan, right? So it's how can we get out of this rut of just heads down execution and say, I want to make the commitment to building a growth organization.
And there was another point that you made that I
Yes.
really liked, and just to refer to
Mhm.
some of the audience members, we have a lot of entrepreneurs, corporate entrepreneurs,
Yes.
and startup
Hmm.
entrepreneurs who listen to this show. I liked your point in chapter 4
Hmm.
about stress testing beliefs
Yes.
around priorities, and it
Hmm.
reminds me of many of the principles of lean startup. When you
Yes.
innovate, that you test assumptions ruthlessly. Do you have a couple of examples, maybe, of this stress testing as you describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of, Stephen, the biggest differentiators of high growth companies is they act on beliefs, not facts. Now,
Mm.
for my corporate entrepreneurs, saying anything along the lines of don't use facts is a bit scary, right? So let's touch on that first. And the notion there is, if you think about it, the most simple way is by the time something has become a fact in the market, there's no longer an insight. Everyone has it, right? If
Mm.
you want to lead a growth strategy, you've got to move ahead of the industry, which means we're making decisions based on beliefs. But beliefs should not be vague truisms, right? Or religious beliefs. We're saying, what are our specific beliefs about how the world, the market's going to frame? And what these high growth companies do, and something people inside corporates have a huge competitive advantage in because they have the resources to do it, is to build a beliefs tracker along with your strategy tracker. So, as a team, what are our top 8 to 10 beliefs about where the industry is going? Could be around regulation, entry and exit, consolidation, talent movements. All of those big trends are going to shape your industry. What are your beliefs on them? Because we struggle to articulate beliefs.
Mm.
We are great in strategy at listing trends, right? We are not good at aligning on beliefs. So once you've got your beliefs, you've got to test them. And then the real power of a growth strategy is what I call parallel pathing, where I'm stress testing my beliefs while I'm executing my strategy. And then as I'm getting learnings on my beliefs being affirmed or not, I'm bringing those insights into execution and making these slight adjustments and adaptations because that's the real power of growth. We
Mm.
romanticize these big sexy pivots. Company was doing A and now it's going to do B. Those are really actually rare and empirically rarely successful. The real power is these constant micro shifts, micro adjustments as we're executing. I'll give you an example. Gordon Food Service, one of the largest food distributors in the United States, multi-billion dollar, also private family-owned firm. And that industry of food distribution, margins are relatively small, right? So slight adjustments or slight things off can make a big difference. Well, coming out of COVID, the restaurant industry was really changing in 21 and 22. So they had a lot of really critical beliefs. Would limited menus of 2020 continue into 21 and 22? How will restaurants want to keep indoor, outdoor takeout, which of course has different menu applications? When will people want deliveries? Do restaurants want help on sanitation, or do they want to move out of this world? So they took their top 10 or 15 beliefs and then they made them into this multiple choice question. And we sent out this quarterly pulse survey to 30,000 restaurants, right? And so they had this constant live feedback from all of their restaurants and customers, some of not their direct customers, on how these beliefs were going. So they were making these monthly and quarterly adjustments in execution because they had that real time feedback based on those top beliefs and were able to move out of it much faster than others in the industry. And I'm using that example purposely because this is not a small startup, right, that can just turn on a dime. This is a multi-country, multi-billion organization that was still able to employ these principles.
And I think the key word you use there, which comes back to lean startup, is the feedback, isn't it? That
Yes.
You use that feedback to revise your beliefs about the world. And to me, one of the real rules of thumb of a strategy, so whether it's just a two-person startup or a much bigger company, is to what extent is there a hypothesis in that strategy? And you see a lot of corporate strategies which are basically plans or shopping lists of we're going to open 50 new stores and we're going to move to this country and we're going to change our logo from red to blue. But there has to be some sort of hypothesis in there. So something that we have a fairly strong belief on, but ultimately we're going to have to go out and test it, and then based on the feedback from the market, we're gonna revise that. And so I really like that parallel, and I like the way it applies to a company of any size, and I think the principles of sound strategy are the same whether you're a massive multinational company or a small startup just starting out in the world.
Absolutely are. And from those examples, Stephen, I'm thinking you've seen too many corporate strategies in your life, right? But
maybe a few.
Yes, yeah. Feedback loops and learning loops are the power of all of this, right? And at some point, as organizations grow, they accidentally turn off the learning. Now, they don't think they are, right? Because they're investing in LMS systems and big L&D teams, and they're sending their teams to business schools, but that's not really learning velocity, right? I call it the shift between being a teaching organization and a learning organization. Whereas in early days, or even in an internal innovation team, we know in early days we've got to learn everything, right? Because we're just guessing. But you've got to watch that as you grow to not turn that learning tap off, because all strategies are a hypothesis, right? I always say we're trying to constantly complete the sentence, if X, then Y. If we take this belief, then what should we be doing? But X is a guess, right? And so Y, what I'm working on, is just the best thing I can do based on that hypothesis. And it's that constant notion of until I've affirmed X, Y is just the best thing at the time, right? I need to keep testing and learning. And so here's what I'm doing. And I know this sounds silly, but words matter. I'm wondering if we should even call it the strategic plan anymore. I'm purposely stopping to use the word plan next to strategy because there's something about the word plan that frames our brains, this must happen. And I want from day one to know the strategy is a moving hypothesis. I'm going to adapt and adjust it. So I'm removing the word plan from it and just calling it the strategy.
Yeah, if you simply have the strategy and the plan as two separate but related things, then that's probably a bit more helpful.
Yeah.
I think there's another interesting point when you were saying about how much information you have. So there's the Jeff Bezos thing about you should make your decision when you've got, say, 80% of the information.
Yes.
It's trying to get people to go between having all the information and none of the information. And how do you get people comfortable with maybe having a little bit less and making quicker decisions?
And that's where the power of testing beliefs comes in, David, right? Because if I know that what happens is, especially with entrepreneurs, whether they're running a company or inside, is we tend to see a trend and jump to implication. Okay, I'm seeing this regulation, I must do X. And there's that middle part about I am seeing X and I believe Y, which means Z for us, right? And it's that middle part about the belief, right? And if you're clear on the belief, then I need much less information to move. I just need enough information to know the belief is tracking. If you're not clear in the belief, you'll form into this waiting for more and more and more and more data. But if I don't know what belief I'm testing, I can inundate you with data, right? And you're
Yeah.
still not going to feel comfortable to move unless you've articulated that belief.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's true for markets and for businesses. I think
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's just getting comfortable with it, which is obviously easier said than done.
There is a comfort with doing any of these things. We are most comfortable when the data tells us we can go, right? The plan tells us how to move, and we've got very clear timeframes we're operating in. The challenge is that's not the real world, right? I'm never going to have perfect data, right? The
Yeah.
plan is going to be a moving target, and the situation around me is going to change as I go. So one of the scariest things an entrepreneur can tell me is, well, I'm just heads down execution mode. And I know that sounds like, well, yeah, you want the Mexican. It's like, no, because as soon as you say I'm heads on execution mode, I'm thinking you're not heads up. You're not seeing the feedback. You're not kind of incorporating that learning. And others are going to now start growing faster than you.
Super. So,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other things I think, thinking about uncertainty is, how can you
Yeah.
encourage people to be more positive in their
Hmm.
approach and their behaviours, because we're never going to get rid of it. So how do we
Yes. Hmm.
embrace it? And I think
Hmm.
you can have a bit of a war of attrition where you just get used to it. But actually, how can you be on the front foot? What does your research and your work show around that?
Yeah, uncertainty is certainly the new certainty, but that doesn't mean I can predict better. And I think we fall into that trap, right? People will say, well, yes, I get it. Uncertainty is the new certainty, but that doesn't mean I can predict any better. So the first is just acknowledging that you can't predict the future. And that sounds silly. And you're both probably internally rolling your eyes saying, I know you can't predict the future.
No.
But if you've
I
seen a
fully agree.
corporate strategy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We give so many slides and charts and graphs and scenarios, we almost kid ourselves we can predict the future. And that's the trap, right? But if
Hmm.
you say, hey, what I want you to build the capability in is making great decisions, even though you can't make great predictions. So embrace uncertainty, accept it for what it is, articulate your beliefs, build the capability of parallel pathing that testing, and then focus on the capability of decision making rather than the capability of predictions.
Yeah, I think that there are too many examples of companies who get very shiny looking documents, often produced
Yes.
by companies that you know very well.
Yes.
And that is used as fact as far as companies are concerned, that this is the best possible forecast of the future. So why would we deviate at all from that? And they're treated as crystal balls about the future.
Yes. And that's, one of the biggest mistakes that I see boards make, and I sit on a lot of board meetings, as I'm sure the two of you do, is they will start the board meeting with that question. They will say, are we on track to plan? And
Mm.
there's something very comforting about being on track to plan. But if you're the board governing a growth company, or really any company, the first question you should always be asking in that meeting is, has the situation changed?
Mm.
Right? Because if the situation's changed, being on track to plan may or may not be a good thing. But much more importantly, we should talk about that now, right? Given the changed
That's right.
situation, what should we be doing instead? So that's the one kind of, I always think like, what are small practical things people can start doing? Change that first question of the meeting from are we on track to plan to has the situation changed? I am now starting to build that capability. I am executing this strategy in a live changing world, and I'm going to do the best if I'm moving and adapting with those changes.
And maybe just making the jump from
Yeah.
uncertainty to volatility.
Yes.
It may or may not be the case that we're in an exceptionally volatile
Yeah.
period at the moment. So certainly the last 4 years
Hmm.
have seemed to be exceptionally
Yes.
volatile. Certainly the perception, I think,
Hmm.
amongst corporate leaders is very much that way.
Hmm.
So amongst the corporate leaders that you serve through your
Hmm.
business, how do you get them to slow down a bit, to zoom
Yeah.
out and look at the longer term picture and focus on what is important, not necessarily what is most urgent?
Yeah, it's difficult, right? And it sounds cliche to say, but the slow down to speed up is the easiest way to simplify it. Is you do need to work with the team to build a couple of these critical capabilities. The most tempting thing to do in volatility is two things, is twofold. One is to wait it out, which is probably one of the biggest traps I see UK companies fall into. UK companies are great at the strategic holding pattern, right? Let's wait until after the election. Let's wait until after the Bank of England decision. Let's wait until kind of we know more. And you're just constantly holding and holding and holding because you're thinking things are too volatile to make a decision. In the US, probably, and I'm way over characterizing, there's of course exceptions, you see the more just do something, right? And we just keep throwing little tactical things at the market, but don't invest in anything enough to really make a difference, right? And so those are the two traps you want to avoid in volatility, either the holding pattern or the kind of chaos, just throw things at the market. And part of that is, do we actually want to grow through volatility? And that sounds silly. Well, who wouldn't want to grow? It's a commitment. It's a choice, right? Because you've got to say, I am going to focus on building the growth capability just as much as I'm focusing on building the growth strategy. So first, acknowledge the volatility. Second, decide if you want to make this commitment, right? And then you need to focus on building capability in your team of things like articulating and testing beliefs, right? Understanding learning loops and how to traverse through them. All of these things we've spoken about is a conscious choice you need to make as an organization.
Yeah. And I mean, you touched on the UK and the US and
Yes.
the different in approaches. I mean, what would you say the sort of broader cultural differences are between the US and the UK, and then also continental Europe? I mean, I think UK kind of straddles it in between.
Yes.
What sort of really struck you?
Yeah. Well, besides the Zs and the Us, right, David, which of course is a big thing in strategy. As I just mentioned, the holding pattern is what I see the most in the UK, right? Is it feels like we had Brexit, right? Then we had COVID, and then we had countless elections over the past 2 years. Even I'm losing count, right? And this used to be what I did for a living. And so there's always this notion of we need to wait until X before we can make a decision, right? And that is a trap that I see organizations fall into. I also see that the growth mindset can sometimes not be there because of how you're defining your market, right? In the US itself is such a massive market for many of the industries we've been talking about, financial, tech, software, or retail, fashion, food as well. That's in place. We don't tend to have as much of the strategic holding pattern until this year, right? There was some of it in 2020, but I've never seen more companies wait for an election results as I have right now in 2024. The thing about the US, we have an election every 4 years. Some of them are quite consequential, but I have never seen more wait until November than I am in this summer going into election than at any other point in my career.
So what's different this year?
So there's much different candidates, right? If we look between Biden and now Harris and Trump, very different regulatory structure that's going to come out on the other end. Very different as far as China relationships, as far as geopolitical involvement, as far as crypto and kind of tech regulation. Are we going to be pro or anti big M&A? And so you saw, I'm sure, over the last couple of weeks in the summer as the Biden campaign kind of transitioned to the Harris campaign, when it was felt it was going to be Biden and Trump was ahead in polls, a lot of massive tech deals got announced, right? And then in the past kind of 10 days, some of those have started to pull back. Now, you could probably blame small things on each of them, but you're seeing the market now say, hold on, I don't actually want to go out there if I'm not now sure what the election results are going to be. So all of those things, even though I'm saying, of course, take a belief, keep executing. And when I push teams on this in either the UK, which of course had the same experience in the spring, and like most of Europe had a big election this year too, guys, 60% of the world's population voted this year.
It's been a big
talk
one,
about
yeah.
volatility, right?
Yeah.
Every major democracy had a major election this year, and at least half of them were a surprising result, right? So we've got a lot of volatility as leaders and companies. And that's why it goes to, what are your beliefs? What would really be different on the other end of this election? That would affect our strategy. And what can we start doing now? And what I like to do is look for what I call a no regret move. So a no regret move is defined very simply as, even if we got our beliefs wrong, we would not regret making this move. And that mindset, and David, it's very similar to some of the other Bezos decision making. It actually really empowers you because you realize, hey, well, actually, regardless of this election, regardless of this regulation, we would still not regret making this move, and always have some of those on the table. Because if you're not letting your team execute, you're not going to have a growth mindset in 9 months, right? So we've got to keep executing, empowering people, and building this capability of growth.
And it's not really been a surprise that we've got these,
Yeah.
there's not a massive difference really between Biden and Harris on their
Yeah.
policies. We knew it's going to be Trump for quite some time.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's holding
Yeah,
passive. There is
and the
things
big
that you
push
can
is
do.
what's real. There's some things that are going to be different, but I think we're getting a bit hyperbolic about some of those as well, right?
Yeah.
And you could argue, is the UK really going to change that much coming out of our recent elections in July? Maybe a bit on the edges for certain industries, but the winners are going to be those who kept executing with that growth mindset and discipline throughout the summer into the autumn, not those who waited until now to start thinking about their strategy.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it's essentially binary. You've got one of two people, at least at the moment,
Yeah.
and obviously tempting fate here by mentioning it.
Yeah.
It's likely to be one of those two people being
Yes.
president, and you're likely to have either a red sweep in Congress or a mixed Congress.
Yes.
So you've got four things to plan for. It
Yeah,
shouldn't be that hard.
we have the scenarios on hand. Things take a while to kind of come through. And if you go back to what choices are we making that will actually be dependent on this, the list is pretty short for most organizations.
And how do you link these electoral cycles
Yeah.
back to the survive, reset, thrive cycle? Are there kind of natural links between the two cycles, or is it just every company's different?
That's a great question. There are certainly times in markets where an election result will trigger you back to survive, but it's pretty rare, right? So an election result could trigger regulatory change, right, which makes a big area of your solution set irrelevant. They could do something on trade, right, or borders opening or closing. So there are times I've certainly seen, right, where a surprise election can trigger that. But that goes back to, but very rarely, right? And that's why we're saying if you're in the reset, keep resetting. If you're in thrive, just be heads up to some of those beliefs. A big system shock will send you into survive. And that can be an external shock, like a COVID or a war or regulatory change, but also be an internal shock can send you into survive as well. So you go to survive, you spend as little time there as you need, but as much as you need. Go into reset, then you can go back to being a thriving organization.
Yeah. So what you're advocating then, if we've understood this correctly, is that
Yeah.
companies always need to be mindful of where in this three-step cycle
Yes.
they're currently positioned, right?
I know that
So
sounds simple, Stephen, but the biggest thing to doing this well is acknowledging where you are now, right?
yeah.
We want to be in thrive all the time, right? But there is this, you need the lack of ego as a leader to say, there has been a shock, right? We need to go into survive mode. And it's quite powerful because what I always remind CEOs is your team knows you're in survive, right? So you not saying it out loud is only, right, kind of loosening that cultural trust you have as a leadership and management team. Acknowledging it means you can get out of it. You can't get out of something you never went into. So not saying we're in survive means we're actually going to get stuck there. Go into the reset, right? And spend the time you need to go through those assumptions. And then you can transition back to that thriving, executing stage again. But the key to doing this well, as simple as it sounds, is being very honest about where you are at any moment in time.
And would you say that is the key attribute or the key attitude to have to make this this journey successful between the three stages?
It's that embracing the loop mentality, right? That we are moving through a loop, not a line. It's never a checklist that will be done, right? And it's a transition between the modes, right? That are harder than the modes themselves. So moving from survive to reset, moving from reset to thrive. And guess what? Sometimes you can move to thrive to reset without needing a stop and survive. Great example is AI, right? For some industries, AI has disrupted the nature of competition. So, regardless of where you are in your strategy cycle, you need to go into a reset. But our brains aren't acknowledging we need to reset because we didn't have a stop and survive. We're so used to, as leaders, having a financial crisis, having a COVID, having a war, having a big regulatory change that we know we need to survive before we go into the reset. AI is so powerful. I always want to say fun, but most people don't maybe think it's fun because hey, you should be resetting your strategy if it's changed the basis of competition in your industry, but you won't have that external trigger that you're used to. You're going to have to force your company into a reset, even if it feels like you should stay in thrive mode a little bit longer.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously, no podcast in 2024 would be
Yes.
complete without a question on
Yeah.
AI somewhere. I'm not going to ask you for your views on AI, etc. But what do your clients ask you about when they bring up the topic of AI?
You know, it's really all over the place, right? So, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it was, is this a thing? right? Should I even think about this? Which sounds silly for people like us who probably live in it. But for most leaders, it's like, is this just going to be the next crypto, the next blockchain, the next web, whatever, right? And literally is what they call it, web whatever, because they can't even keep track of what number we're on right now. And there's a fear that I don't want to dig in again if this isn't going to be a thing. So that's a pretty big question. Then, of course, where do I get started, right? And the great conversation I'm having this summer is, we're really doing well at personal productivity. We've learned to summarize meeting notes and draft emails and messages and, automate some manual tasks. How do I make the transition to reinvention and reimagining strategic processes and doing new things? And that's the conversation I'm having right now, which I'm enjoying, right? So the biggest question is shift from, is this it, to how do I get started, to how do I move from personal productivity to actually reimagining how I do business?
Mm. Well, that sounds like a whole new book or a whole new
Yes,
topic of
yes.
discussion. Great. Well, we'll
Have
we'll have
you?
to call you back in for round
I would
two
love
then,
to.
once you've got a
Yes.
bit more material on that.
Yeah.
I was going to say, have you got any examples you can share with us? I know you're obviously working with clients, you might
All
not be able
premature,
to,
but
but
yeah, so there's a couple different things. So, the what I'm doing is, what we'll do is, you walk through the value chain, right? So it's strategy 101. And I love when strategy 101 comes back into these new technologies. Walk through your organizational value chain. At each step of the value chain, ask how that step from R&D to supply chain management has been reinvented. But then part two is, you take a step back, David, and say, which parts of this value chain can we eliminate, right? Which parts of this value chain, do we need to add? And so the old school tool of the value chain we've had since Porter in the 70s, right, is your go-to tool for starting to reimagine your business. And Moderna just had their earnings reports out this morning. They're a great example. If you look at Moderna and the COVID vaccine process, that's what they did, right? They said, hey, the traditional pharma value chain has these, 15 to 20 steps. We're going to use AI to cut out 5 or 6 of them, right? And fundamentally loop through all those different examples.
Mhm. Great, Rebecca. We're going to have
Yes.
to wrap up now because,
Yeah.
well, we've had a fantastic discussion and
Yeah.
you've given us so much to think about. Like I said, I've really enjoyed reading this book of yours, and
Thank you.
I'm sure that anyone listening to this podcast today who'd like to dig into some of these issues more, well, they'll know to go to their favorite e-commerce store and find your book. If someone would like to reach out to you directly, what's the best way to get hold of you, Rebecca?
Yeah, absolutely. So all the videos, articles, loops are on surviveresetthrive.com or RebeccaHomkes.com. I'm also super active on LinkedIn, so everyone should just reach out to me there, send me a note, and I'd love to stay in touch.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Great. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Rebecca. Thank you so much. I certainly got my mind thinking on a lot of these very, very familiar topics, but in a new angle. So thank you so much for your time today.
No, thank you, Stephen. Thank you, David. It was my pleasure.
super. Thanks, Rebecca.